On the 3rd of May, 1469, a little bloke comes into the world in Florence. He's going to teach rulers all about trickery, dodgy deals, and knocking off rivals to grab power. His name will be stuck to ruthless cunning forever. Even 500 years down the track, we still use the word Machiavellian for someone who manipulates without a shred of guilt. But the bloke who wrote that handbook for dictators never had any real power himself, ended up flat broke, and spent his final days begging for a job from the very family he'd helped knock over. The world Niccolò Machiavelli was born into was walking a tightrope. In 1469, Florence was the shining gem of Renaissance Italy, where bankers had more pull than bishops, and art, philosophy, and political backstabbings all flourished together. The cathedral's dome towered over the city, a nod to what humans can dream up. Wealth flooded the streets, but underneath all that marble and fancy paintings, something darker was cooking. Italy wasn't one big country. It was a mess of pieces. The whole region was like a patchwork of city-states, all trying to be top dog: Milan, Venice, Rome, Naples, and Florence. 5 big players locked in a never-ending stoush. Alliances swapped around faster than the weather. One day your mates, next day your enemies. The condottieri, those hired armies, fought for whoever paid the most, and they'd switch sides mid-battle if a better offer came up. Loyalty was just something to trade, and treason was seen as a smart play. That's the world of beautiful brutality Niccolò was born into, the second son of Bernardo Machiavelli and Bartolomeo di Nelli. Their family tree went way back and had a good name, but they were dead broke. Their surname carried some clout in Florence's complicated social scene, but their bank balance told a different story. Bernardo worked as a lawyer, but he wasn't exactly rolling in it. Bernardo had a small farm just outside the city, growing enough grub to keep the family fed. He also kept a close eye on his books. We know this because his diary survived, a record of what he spent and what books he lent out, showing a bloke with not much money, but a real thirst for knowledge. Bernardo couldn't afford to hire tutors for his boys, but he loved learning with a passion, knowing it was the only inheritance he could leave him. He taught Niccolò himself, getting him deep into Latin, the language of law, politics, and all serious study. Together they dug into Livy, the famous Roman historian, who chronicled how the Republic rose up. All those hours spent working out classical Latin shaped everything Niccolò would later write. The young fellow was smart, curious, and a bit of a troublemaker, always asking uncomfortable questions. He noticed the gap between what people said and what they did. Florence preached Christian morals, but played dirty in business. Church blokes would bang on against loan interest from the pulpit, while bankers were crunching numbers in the pews. The Republic talked a big game about freedom, but one family, the Medicis, was pulling all the important strings. When Niccolò was growing up, Florence was run by Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent. He didn't have an official title. The Medicis were technically just private citizens in a republic. But Lorenzo controlled the banks, fixed the elections, put his mates in every important job, and got rid of enemies with deadly precision. He acted as a poet, an arts patron, and a philosopher king, even if he wasn't officially one. He hired Botticelli for projects and had Michelangelo hanging around his crew. He turned Florence into Europe's cultural hotspot, while quietly chipping away at its democratic structures. That was Niccolò's first real lesson in how power actually works. If you watch closely enough, you see that talk is cheap. Constitutions are just for show. What really matters is who controls the money, who's got loyalty locked in, and who's ready to act when others drop the ball. Florence reckoned it was free, but it was bowing down to a banker's son. That contradiction was everywhere, only obvious if you didn't look away on purpose. Then, in 1492, 2 deaths wrecked the fragile balance. Lorenzo the Magnificent kicked the bucket in April, his body stuffed with gout, and his political smarts buried with him. Piero, his boy, took over the reins but didn't have a lick of his dad's talent. That same year, Columbus rocked up in the Americas. But no one in Florence really twigged how much this discovery would shake up world trade and make Italy less important. Piero de' Medici was the complete opposite of his old man, full of himself instead of smart, and dead-set rigid instead of flexible. He made enemies left, right, and center without a second thought. When Charles VIII of France came storming into Italy in 1494 with an army bigger than anyone's seen in ages, Piero got spooked and gave up the fortresses. He gave away land and disgraced Florence without even a fight. The city kicked off, mobs flooded the streets, and Piero did a runner under the cover of night. The Medici houses got ransacked, and a new republic was declared, not the tame one from Lorenzo's day, but a rougher, more chaotic one. More genuine, it was into this gap that a Dominican monk called Girolamo Savonarola stepped in. Savonarola was either a prophet or a madman, depending who you asked. His sermons said God's punishment was just around the corner, and Florence had to clean up its act. He organized the Bonfire of the Vanities, a do where locals burnt books, paintings, makeup, and anything else they reckoned was sinful. Even Botticelli chucked some of his own works in the fire. Florence used to be the top jewel of Renaissance humanist culture. All of a sudden, it switched back to a medieval way of thinking, convinced that the French invasion and political mess were God's payback for all the fancy living and sin. Niccolò watched all this from the sidelines. In 1494, he was 25, old enough to get what was going on, but too young and flat broke to have any sway. He didn't have a job or a backer. No clear path ahead. He'd studied Latin and history, and sharpened his analytical mind, something fierce. But what good was that in a city split over whether God wanted him to wreck artworks? Savonarola's time in charge couldn't last. He made way too many enemies. He openly went against the Pope, calling Alexander VI the crook dead right, but bloody stupid, and basically self-destructive. In 1498, Florence turned its back on its prophet. Savonarola was grabbed, tortured, hanged, and then burned in the Piazza della Signoria. His remains were chucked in the Arno River so no one could collect any relics. That same year, something unexpected happened. The brand new Florentine Republic needed a new second chancellor, the bloke responsible for handling diplomatic letters and army stuff. The gig wasn't the most powerful, but it mattered, and they needed someone clever, capable, and dependable. A candidate who could talk the talk, think ahead, and kept their mates close during the recent drama. On the 19th of June, 1498, Niccolò Machiavelli got the job. Exactly how he scored the position is a mystery. He'd never had a government job before, his family had no special pull, and he wasn't rich or connected to big-shot backers. But someone saw something in him. Maybe it was his writing, a reference from someone we don't know about, or just plain luck, whatever it was. At 29, Niccolò suddenly got a foot in the door of government business. The Second Chancery looked after the outer territories, the Contado, plus Florence's satellite towns and regions, which meant writing heaps of letters. Keeping in touch with army commanders and dealing with foreign diplomats. Just a few weeks into the job, Niccolò also got made secretary to the Ten of War, the council that oversaw all the military action. He suddenly found himself right in the thick of things, taking notes in councils where the Republic's future was debated, writing orders to army bigwigs, and reading spy reports. And Florence needed every bit of help it could get, seeing as the Republic was surrounded by threats. Cesare Borgia was dead set on carving out his own little kingdom in central Italy, and he went about it with no mercy and plenty of efficiency. Meanwhile, Venice had its eye on Florentine land, while France and Spain treated Italy like their own personal battle arena. Pisa had broken away from Florence and was fighting tooth and nail for its freedom, while Florence's own army was an absolute joke. Almost all their soldiers were mercenaries blokes, only in it for the cash, and they were expensive, unreliable, and downright dangerous. Mercenaries would avoid a fight whenever they could, because dead soldiers don't get paid, and they'd switch sides for a better offer. They'd even pillage the very places they were supposed to protect. And if you didn't pay them on time, they'd just as soon turn on your own city as the enemy. Niccolò saw this mess up close his job, had him visiting army camps, where he watched condottiero leaders haggling like market vendors while battles were being lost. He saw these hired commanders mucking about and dragging their feet, keeping their own soldiers safe while Florence footed the bill. He watched his own city drain its coffers on troops that gave nothing but empty excuses. In October 1499, Niccolò got his first big diplomatic gig, heading off to France to cut a deal with King Louis XII. Florence needed French support against its enemies, but it didn't have the dosh to meet the king's demands. Niccolò's job was to string him along, dodge any promises, and keep the alliance alive without offering stuff Florence couldn't deliver. He spent 6 months at the French court. As a low-level bloke from a minor Italian state, he found it bloody hard to navigate the politics of a big European kingdom. Louis XII kept him waiting for weeks, and the French nobles treated him with barely hidden contempt. He had no cash, no gifts to give, No pull except his gift of the gab, but he soaked up every experience. He saw how real power worked at the top. He realized that kings cared more about force than legal arguments. Deals were useless, unless you had army strength to back them up. France would only support Florence as long as it suited French interests, not a moment longer. Alliances between countries were just an illusion. The real motivator was always self-interest. The whole experience was both humiliating and eye-opening. Niccolò sent back reports to Florence chock full of detailed notes on the French army, the court's political factions, and the king's personality. His letters were sharp and analytical, with none of the usual diplomatic niceties. Instead of reporting what people said, he wrote about what they wanted and what scared him. When he finally got back to Florence in 1501, he was a changed man. The textbook idea of power he'd got from reading Livy had come up against real life. He now knew what worked and what didn't, not from books but from watching kings and generals in action. Later, in 1502, Florence sent him to meet someone who'd stick in his mind forever. Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, had become the most feared bloke in Italy. In just 3 years, he'd brought a dozen towns under his control, mixing military might with sneaky tricks and unbelievable brutality. He knocked off enemies at dinner parties and strangled mates who'd outlived their usefulness. He'd rip up agreements the moment they became a hassle, and it worked a treat. While Florence was arguing in committees and stressing over legal nitpicks, Cesare Borgia was busy building an empire. Niccolò rocked up to Borgia's court in Imola as a rep from a nervous republic, trying to figure out if they were next on the hit list. What he saw fascinated and horrified him at the same time. Borgia was methodical, clever, and completely cold-blooded. He'd lay out his plans straight up, almost proudly. He brought stability to areas that were once chaotic, getting rid of the petty tyrants who'd been ripping off the locals. Yep, he used force, but only carefully and sparingly, to achieve specific objectives. He didn't bother with apologies or pretending to be virtuous. He just got on with it, and the results did the talking. For months, Niccolò watched how Borgia operated. He was there at Senigallia when Borgia tricked his own mutinous captains into a meeting and had them all choked a real work of betrayal. The captains were scheming against him, so he pretended to make peace, asked them to come for talks, and wiped them all out in one night. Job done, that's power, without any nonsense. Borgia couldn't give a toss about being liked, only about being obeyed. He knew that a bit of harshness, used firmly at the right time, could stop worse violence down the track. Fear beats love, he told Niccolò, 'cause fear's reliable and love isn't. Back in Florence, Niccolò wrote reports covering everything he'd seen. The Republic's higher-ups read his accounts of Borgia's tricks with the same sort of uncomfortable fascination that Niccolò himself felt. Here was a model of efficiency they could never use in public, but couldn't stop thinking about in private. Florence was up to its neck in committees and arguments, while blokes like Borgia were taking over entire states. A simple and bloody awful question popped into Niccolò's head. What if virtue, the usual way folks think of it, was actually a weakness? What if all those qualities everyone raves about, mercy, honesty, generosity, were actually downsides for leaders? What if getting ahead meant doing things that damn your soul? He didn't have any answers yet, but he was starting to reckon that everything he'd learnt about how to live was totally off. That was the honest truth for anyone wanting to make it in politics. The trick was how to say it out loud without getting yourself burnt as a heretic or kicked out as a lunatic back in 1503. Everything went to shit. Pope Alexander VI croaked suddenly, and with him went Cesare Borgia's whole foundation. Turns out, building an empire on your old man's position has a catch. When the old man dies, the empire disappears. Borgia was so busy grabbing land that he forgot to lock down the one relationship that really counted, and inside a few months, it was all gone. His enemies came back, his armies fell apart, and the bloke who'd terrorized Italy got arrested, locked up, and eventually killed in a small fight in Spain. Niccolò watched the whole mess with a grim sort of fascination. This was the lesson Borgia himself never got. Power based only on force and fear is bloody fragile. It needs constant upkeep, non-stop watchfulness, and the second your strength slips, everything crumbles. Borgia only clocked half the puzzle. He knew how to grab power, but not how to hold on to it. He relied completely on his dad's backing and his own military wins, never setting up the institutional foundations that could have outlasted them both. That stuff up taught Niccolò something key. Being effectively ruthless wasn't enough. You needed systems, laws, and institutions that could keep going without you. The Romans got that they mixed military conquest with legal setups and civic structures that made their empire last. Borgia was a tactical genius, but strategically hopeless. Meanwhile, Florence's troubles got worse. The city still didn't have a proper army, just pricey mercenaries who fought without much effort and changed sides if the pay was better. In 1505, Niccolò put forward something pretty radical. Florence should set up its own militia, a citizen army from the countryside. The idea was controversial, giving weapons to peasants, trusting ordinary folks with arms. The aristocrats were bloody horrified, but Florence was desperate, and Niccolò was convincing. He reckoned that blokes fighting for their own city would be more reliable than paid foreigners fighting for cash. He kept banging on about Roman examples. He wrote proposals, gave speeches, ground down the opposition through pure persistence, and finally, they let him have a go. He traveled through the Tuscan countryside, recruiting farmers and getting them into military units. He designed training programs, wrote manuals, and kept an eye on drills. For 3 years, this was his obsession. Building an army from nothing. Back in 1509, his militia finally got into a real fight, showing that a republic could look after itself without needing mercenaries or outside help. For over 10 years, Florence had been trying to get Pisa back under control. That city was a bit of a rebel under their rule. All the earlier attempts with hired soldiers had come to nothing. But Niccolò's mob, who were loyal to Florence rather than cash, finally broke through Pisa's resistance. Pisa gave in. It weren't exactly a flash military op. The siege took ages. The fightin' was messy, and heaps of stuff went wrong. But it worked. Florence won with its own blokes, and Niccolò had proved his point. With the right setup, republics could be deadly on the battlefield. At 40, he was at the top of his game, respected, influential, and given important diplomatic jobs. He traveled all over Italy, meeting kings and popes, and helping shape Florence's foreign policy. He was married to Marietta, who kept the house going and looked after the kids while he was away on state business a lot. He had a steady gig in the chancery with a decent wage. Every goal he'd been chasing since his 20s had come true. But come August 1512, Spanish troops marched into Tuscany. The political scene in Italy had changed big time. The French, who'd been protecting Florence, got beaten and booted out of the peninsula. The Medici, who'd been kicked out of Florence for 18 years, came back with Spanish military support. The Florentine government, set up specifically to keep the Medici out, was always going to collapse. Florence tried to fight back, and Niccolò's militia was called up to defend the Republic. But citizen troops, keen as they were, just couldn't match the experienced Spanish soldiers. In Prato, a town near Florence, Spanish soldiers butchered the defenders and ransacked the place with shocking brutality. The message was obvious. Give in, or cop the same treatment. Florence surrendered, and the Republican government packed it in. The Medici took back control of the city, backed by Spanish military might. In one night, everything changed. The institutions and councils that run Florence for nearly 20 years were shut down. The blokes who'd worked in those bodies found themselves out of a job overnight. Worse still, Niccolò, who'd loyally served the Republic for 14 years, suddenly became a person of interest. His high profile and strong links to the old government made him a target. In November 1512, the new Medici government sacked him and took away his position. He wasn't allowed to go near the Palazzo Vecchio and was exiled to his little farm 7 miles from Florence. His income stopped, his diplomatic jobs ended, and his influence disappeared. At 43, he suddenly became a nobody. Things got even worse in February 1513. A plot to knock over the Medici was uncovered. Some bloke had put together a list of possible supporters, people who could help bring down the new government. Niccolò's name was on that list. He had no idea why he hadn't been part of any plan, but his name was there, written on a document found in a conspirator's stuff. That was enough. They arrested him, chucked him in jail, and put him through torture. This nasty business was called the strapardo. They tied his hands behind his back, chucked a rope on him, and yanked him up. Then they dropped him like a sack of potatoes, and his shoulders copped a real wrenching in their sockets. They did that 6 times, all the while demanding he fess up to being part of the conspiracy. But he had nothing to fess up to. Every time they dropped him and the pain hit, he kept saying he was innocent. In the end, they either believed him or decided he wasn't worth the bother. When Giovanni de' Medici got elected as Pope Leo X in March 1513, they declared a general amnesty to celebrate. They let all the prisoners go, and Niccolò was one of them. But the damage was already done. His body was killing him from the torture. His career was stuffed. His reputation was wrecked by all the suspicion. He went back to his farm with no job, no dough, and no future to speak of. The farm was dead small, barely enough to feed his family. He had a bit of land, a few tenant farmers, and a modest little place to live. It was nothing like his old life in Florence, where he'd travel to meet royalty, have a say in policy, and be someone important. Now his days were all about managing the olive harvest and dealing with the petty annoyances of country living. His letters from that time are heart-wrenching but also pretty funny in a dark way. He talks about wandering his property, checking on trees, arguing with dodgy woodcutters, and playing cards at the local pub. With the butcher and the baker, blokes who couldn't read, arguing about grain prices and gossiping, Niccolò, who'd once negotiated with the French king, sat there listening, trying not to nod off. Every day was the same humiliating grind. Mornings on the farm meant sorting out farming issues he couldn't give a toss about, and afternoons at the pub playing cards with blokes who reckoned his diplomatic know-how was useless. Evenings were a write-off, sitting outside his place watching peasants walk past on the road. He felt himself disappearing, his brain going soft from doing sweet nothing. All the knowledge he'd picked up over 14 years at the heart of Florentine politics was going to waste. But then, at night, something shifted. He'd go into his study and do this little ritual. In a letter to his mate Francesco Vittori, he explained it. He'd strip off his muddy farm gear. After getting rid of the clothes covered in dust and olive oil, he'd put on the fancy robes he used to wear at court, the posh threads of a government official. Then, he'd open his books by old authors like Livy, Tacitus, Plutarch, and Polybius, and read for hours. He'd get lost in stories of Roman politics and military campaigns, and while reading, he'd imagine he was chatting with these ancient writers. He'd ask them questions, they'd answer back, and he'd argue with blokes who'd been dead for over 1,000 years. In those made-up chats, he felt alive again. He stepped back into the world of ideas and power. Even if it was just in his head, it wasn't escapism. It was survival. If he couldn't be part of politics, at least he could think about it. If he couldn't give advice to princes, he could work out how they really ticked. And if Florence didn't want his know-how, he'd make it last forever and write it all down. The book that came out of those nightly sessions would later be called The Prince, even though Niccolò originally named it just De Principis Patibus, about principalities. He wrote it in 1513, working like a madman. He chucked 14 years of diplomatic know-how and a lifetime of studying history into a short, brutal guide on how power really works. This wasn't some abstract philosophy. It was hands-on, real-life stuff. He based every chapter on solid examples from his own life or old texts. He wrote it as advice for a ruler, specifically Lorenzo de' Medici, the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent who was running Florence at the time. That dedication was a smart play. Maybe if the Medici had a read and saw how good it was, they'd give him his old job back. Maybe by showing his worth through his writing, he could get back what he'd lost after being tortured and exiled. The book's main idea was simple, but bloody shocking. Chuck out all that usual stuff about how princes should behave. Don't worry about that old mirror for princes style that had been guiding political thinking for ages. All those religious books telling kings to be good and fair, with God's reward hanging around, that's all a myth. This is the real deal. A ruler's job is to keep the state safe and hold on to power. Everything else comes second. Sometimes you need to be kind, other times tough, sometimes honest, sometimes tricky, sometimes generous, and sometimes tight-fisted. It all depends on the situation. There's no one-size-fits-all rule. He split rulers into types. Hereditary kings who get stable kingdoms have it easier, but new princes who grab power face way more trouble. Republics and principalities are different, each needing its own game plan. Then he went through all the dramas rulers face, with a no-nonsense attitude. Is it better for a prince to be loved or feared? Fear's the better option. 'Cause love is unreliable and people are flaky, they'll do a runner at the first chance. Properly handled fear keeps them in line even when goodwill's gone. But don't make them hate you, 'cause hate leads to scheming. Should a prince keep his promises? Only if it's in his best interest to do so. Deals are just tools, not sacred vows. Break them when you have to, but have a good excuse ready so you don't come across as just a dodgy bloke. Is it better for a prince to be cruel or merciful? Well, It depends. Softness that leads to chaos and hurt is actually cruel, while toughness that brings order and prevents more bloodshed is real mercy. Cesare Borgia, he knocked off rivals and strangled allies, brought peace to places that were once lawless. His ways were rough, but the results were good. Should a prince rely on fortresses? A prince should use fortresses now and then, but not as his main protection. Real security comes from not making the people hate him. Should he rely on mercenaries? He should never trust hired guns they fight badly and swap sides all the time. Instead, use his own troops. Should he always keep studying warfare? A leader who doesn't know about military stuff will get stuffed by those who do, even if he's a good bloke. At this point, Niccolò got really bold. A prince absolutely has to look virtuous. People judge by appearances, but actually being virtuous in every situation just ruins you. You need to be flexible enough to act unethically when the situation calls for it. Get good at doing the wrong thing when necessary. The ruler who refuses to do evil when needed will get knocked over by someone who doesn't give a toss. That was a radical idea dressed up as practical advice. For over 1,000 years, Christian political thinking had said that rulers have to be moral. It reckoned that being good leads to success, that the bad get punished, and the good get rewarded by God. Niccolò reckoned the opposite, that morality's a luxury. Sometimes, evil works better than good. The universe doesn't reward being virtuous. It rewards what gets results, but he wasn't chuffed about that. His tone in The Prince is cold and almost scientific. It's about reality, not ideals. He's like a doctor diagnosing a sickness, not a preacher celebrating sin. But the implications were bloody terrifying. If leaders have to act only on what works, ignoring morals, what stops them becoming monsters? His answer was practical, not moral. Don't be cruel for no reason. Don't lie if honesty helps you more. Never break deals, unless you gotta. Unnecessary cruelty just makes enemies and gets you nowhere. But if you need to be cruel, do it quick, do it properly, and then move on. Finished in 1513, The Prince was written in a passionate spurt over a few months. Niccolò dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, the new boss of Florence, hoping it'd bring back his own status. He sent off the manuscript and waited for a reply that never came. Lorenzo only gave it a quick once, over. The work that was going to change political philosophy for centuries was brushed off by the bloke it was meant for. As the years rolled by, Niccolò stayed out of real power, living on his small farm, writing plays and histories, swapping letters with mates, and slowly getting more bitter. The Prince was shared around in handwritten copies to a small crowd, read and argued about in private, but it never got printed while Niccolò was alive. It only came out in 1532, 5 years after he died. The reaction was intense. The Catholic Church put it on its list of banned books. Protestant critics called it devilish. A whole new genre of writing against Machiavelli popped up, with authors competing to bash his cynicism and dodgy morals. In England, Machiavellian became a quick way to say evil. Shakespeare's villains used his ideas. Marlowe showed him on stage as a demon. The French Huguenot Innocent Gentillet blamed Machiavelli for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Gentillet reckoned Machiavelli's teachings corrupted the French court and caused the massacre of thousands of Protestants. But here's the weird thing. Everyone publicly bagged the book. But rulers read it in secret. Cardinals hid copies in their libraries. And monarchs got it translated for their own use. It became the most influential banned book across Europe. Why? Because its ideas actually worked. The tactics Niccolò laid out really did work in real politics. Leaders saw their own moves reflected in his book, and their strategies were mirrored back with creepy accuracy. Did Niccolò really back immorality, or was he just reporting what rulers already did? That question's been dividing folks for 500 years. Some reckon he's a teacher of evil, stuffing up government by telling rulers to ignore morals. Others say he was a fair critic, calling out the hypocritical front that let leaders claim God's okay for their dodgy deeds. He didn't dirty politics, he just refused to pretend it was squeaky clean. There's another, darker reading that's way more interesting. Maybe the prince was never meant to tell kings how to rule. It could have been a warning for the people. By spelling out all the dodgy tricks tyrants use, Niccolò was teaching the average punter about the real game of power. He was pulling back the curtain on how oppression works, so folks could spot it and fight back. That dedication to Lorenzo? Probably a red herring. a way to get dangerous info out there under the cover of flattery. That reading makes sense of some weird bits in the book. Like, why does he hype up Cesare Borgia's moves, but then casually mention he's stuffed up and died a miserable death? And why explain how to crush republics while also noting how fiercely they resist and how tough they are to hold on to? Then he finishes with a passionate call to kick foreign rulers out of Italy. What's that about? Chapter 26 doesn't fit with the cold, practical vibe of the rest of the book, unless the whole thing was really about sneaky rebellion dressed up as obedience. We'll probably never know for sure. Niccolò never fessed up about what he was on about, but that uncertainty says a lot. The exact same text can be read as a manual for dictators or a how-to for kicking them out. It all comes down to the reader and what they're looking for. No doubt, though, Niccolò totally flipped political thinking on its head. Before him, it was all about Plato's question: what's the perfect state? How should we set up society to be fair and moral? Niccolò asked something different. How do governments actually work? What makes them solid or shaky? How is power really gained and kept? He shifted focus from the ideal to the real, from how things ought to be to how they actually are. That's where political science split off from political philosophy. Instead of going on about how things should be set up based on some theory of fairness, he watched how stuff really happens, based on human nature. That's the difference between morals and machinery. Niccolò was dead keen on the machinery. His method was all about cold, hard evidence. He dove deep into Roman history over and over, looking for patterns that kept popping up. He would compare old stories with the modern situations he'd seen with his own eyes. If a rule held true across different times and places, he'd write it down as a principle. That approach, seeing politics as something you study methodically instead of just guessing about ethics, was revolutionary. It made him the very first modern political scientist. He was the first to look at governance like a doctor treating a sickness, not a priest dealing with sin. But the prince was just the beginning. While he was hoping for a political career that never got off the ground again, Niccolò wrote a much bigger and probably more important book. The Discourses on Livy took years to finish. He probably started it before The Prince and wrapped it up after. Where The Prince is all about monarchies and single rulers, The Discourses looks at republics and group leadership. It's longer, more complex, more logically argued, and gives a better idea of what Niccolò really believed. The way it's written is a bit deceptive. It pretends to be a commentary on the first 10 books of Livy's Roman history. He uses bits from Roman history as springboards for political ideas. But really, it's a well-organized treatise on republican government, disguised as history lessons. Why all the trickery? Because openly backing republicanism around kings and popes was way too risky. Safer to just pretend you're chatting about ancient Rome. The core arguments built up bit by bit. A well-set-up republic lasts longer and is tougher than a principality. No worries. Instead of relying on just one bloke, they draw on the smarts and energy of heaps of citizens. They set up institutions that outlast any single person. They bring in wealth and military strength that monarchies can't match. Rome became the top dog of the ancient world, and that wasn't despite being a republic. Nah. It was exactly because it was a republic that Rome got so great, which goes straight against what the prince says about one ruler. So what did Niccolò really reckon? Princes or republics? The Discourses makes it pretty clear. For free folk, republics are the go, but when a society's rooted and its people ain't got the gumption for self-rule, you need a prince to restore order from the top. The type of government should match the state of the people. Niccolò saw Florence's republic fall apart into chaos and bickering. He saw citizens prove they couldn't handle the discipline and sacrifice that a republic needs. Sometimes you need a strong leader to break the corruption cycle and lay the foundations to rebuild republican freedom down the track. The work split into 3 parts, each looking at a different bit of how the Roman Republic was run. The first part covers domestic institutions, how Rome organized itself inside. The second bit's about foreign policy and military stuff. The third part checks out how individual leaders shape events. But the big theme is human nature and how institutions can steer it towards good stuff instead of harm. Niccolò reckoned people are basically out for themselves, not evil deep down, but not naturally good either. They'll act decent when it suits them, and turn nasty when that's more profitable. You can't change that, but you can set up institutions that make self-interest line up with the common good. Make systems where people, by chasing their own benefit, accidentally help everyone. redirect selfishness into productive results, rather than trying to wipe it out. This went against old-school Christianity, which said human nature was stuffed by sin and needed God's grace for saving. Humanists, though, thought education could polish people up and make them truly good. Niccolò knocked back both views. People are what they are best to accept that reality instead of dreaming about changing them. Build institutions that work with flawed humans, not imaginary saints. His look at Roman institutions showed how that played out in real life. The fight between patricians and plebeians, the rich and the poor, most historians saw that as Rome's weakness, but Niccolò saw it as its strength. The clash between the classes stopped either side from taking full control. It forced them to negotiate and created laws that protected both groups. The tribunes gave ordinary folks the power to stop the aristocrats from overstepping. The Senate gave the rich a chance to direct their ambitions in a productive way. The result was dynamic stability, a setup that turned conflict into law. Not always smoothly, because Rome did have civil wars, but compared to other ancient societies, it held together incredibly well for centuries. Modern political thinking owes him for this idea. Constitutional checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism. Each of these systems assumes different groups will compete for advantage and aims to set up structures where that competition leads to good outcomes. When they were setting up a system with separate powers where each branch keeps an eye on the others, Madison and the other founding fathers took a lot of inspiration from Machiavelli's writings. They actually put Niccolò's ideas into action, pitting ambition against ambition and using self-interest for the common good. His writings also went deeper into his thoughts on war. He had no time for mercenaries blokes who fight for whoever pays them. Those soldiers had no loyalty, no real motivation to fight hard, and nothing to risk their necks for except their pay. On the other hand, citizen soldiers were more upstanding folk, fighting for their own suburb, their own family, and their own stuff. Where mercenaries would leg it, these blokes would stand their ground and die if they had to. Rome ruled the world, thanks to its citizen legions. When Italian city-states hired Swiss mercenaries, they got smashed. The lesson was obvious. This wasn't just about how to fight. It hit at the heart of what it means to be a citizen. For a republic to last, it needs people who are ready to fight and die for it. If blokes won't defend their own country and instead farm that job out, then the republic's pretty much dead. The surface stuff and ceremonies might keep going, but the real spirit's gone. In Florence, Niccolò saw it with his own eyes. Rich merchants who wouldn't join the militias. Their decision to hire mercenaries made him weak militarily, and they ended up conquered. He proposed creating citizen armies, training ordinary people in weapons, and bringing back the Roman way of doing things. He actually got a chance to put this into practice in 1506, when Florence gave him the job of organizing a militia from the countryside. He signed up farmers, trained them, equipped them, and that was his biggest achievement. In 1509, his citizen army helped Florence take back Pisa after a 10-year siege. It worked. Regular folks as soldiers could really fight. But when the Spanish turned up in 1512, his militia fell apart. Farmers with pikes didn't have a hope against experienced Spanish infantry. The whole thing came to nothing. Florence was taken over, and Niccolò's short time of influence ended with him being locked up and tortured. Still, he never gave up his belief. The problem was in how it was done and the circumstances, not the basic idea. His later years were a slow decline. After The Prince and the Discourses, he wrote more stuff. Commissioned by the Medici, he wrote a history of Florence, a fairer and more polished piece than his earlier stuff, plus a book on military art that went further into his war ideas. He also wrote several plays, including Mandragola, a comedy that's still genuinely funny and still gets performed. He kept his intellectual work going, but his political importance was gone. The Medici would sometimes throw him a small job or a diplomatic trip to keep him sweet, but nothing much. He watched younger blokes move up, while he himself faded into obscurity. Talented writers and thinkers who hadn't been through what he had, who hadn't stood by the Republic in its darkest times, got jobs and praise. He couldn't hide how bitter he was. In letters to mates, he complained about being ignored, his talents wasted, and the chance of dying forgotten. In 1527, it all fell to pieces again. Pope Clement VII from the Medici family made a big mistake in judgment, getting stuck between France and Spain while they fought for control in Italy. The troops of Emperor Charles V, they hadn't been paid and were mutinous and marched on Rome. What happened next is known as the sack of Rome, one of the worst disasters that city's ever seen. For months, German and Spanish soldiers roamed around the Eternal City, killing, looting, and wrecking everything. The Pope got away to Castel Sant'Angelo, helpless, as he watched his capital burn. The effects were felt all the way to Florence, where the Medici's power base in Rome was destroyed. The people of Florence rebelled and kicked the Medici out again, bringing back the Republic for a third time. Niccolò must have felt a wave of hope. So here's another chance. But by the time he was 60 and not in the best health, maybe Florence would finally give him credit for what he'd done before. They'd missed the boat decades ago. Because of his links to the Medici family, the new Republican government saw him as a bit dodgy. For 15 years, he'd taken their jobs, written up their history, and filled in for some minor official gigs. That mark just wouldn't come off. By June 1527, only a few weeks later, the Republic had totally cut him off. Niccolò fell ill. We don't know exactly what it was, probably something gut-related, pretty common back when there were no antibiotics. He took to his bed, at his place near Florence. His mates came around, and he cracked jokes, told stories, and whinged about his tummy troubles before kicking the bucket on the 21st of June, 1527, at 58. No fancy funeral or official accolades. Buried in Florence's Santa Croce church, his grave stayed unknown for centuries. Even though he'd completely changed political theory, he died a nobody, written off as a letdown by his own town. His family held on to his manuscripts. His son Bernardo knew they were important, even if Florence didn't. Slowly, bit by bit, the world started finding out about Niccolò's work. Published in 1532, 5 years after he died, The Prince was quickly followed by The Discourses. These books spread across Europe faster than you'd think. Kings, advisors, army chiefs, scholars, priests, everyone read them, and they had strong reactions, mostly shock. Then the Catholic Church banned The Prince and put it on their index of forbidden books. By 1559, the book was seen as satanic, a manual for tyranny by someone with no morals or faith. Protestant reformers were just as tough, saying it proved how dodgy Italians were, with the Pope's political scheming mucking up worldly thinking. Cardinal Reginald Pole called Niccolò an enemy of humanity, saying the book was written by the devil himself. The word Machiavellian made its way into English, meaning sneaky, dishonest, and ruthless. Shakespeare's bad guys Iago, Richard III, Edmund were called Machiavels. The name itself turned into a word for pure evil. But people kept reading, because deep down they knew it was true. Rulers really did behave like Niccolò said, and governments ran the way he described. You could bag him out in public while secretly following his advice. That kind of hypocrisy was spot on. When he was younger, Frederick the Great of Prussia wrote anti-Machiavelli, all self-righteous, slamming everything Niccolò stood for. But when he became king, he ruled exactly by the prince's playbook. He was ruthless and practical, happy to break treaties if it helped, only caring about growing Prussia. Anti-Machiavelli gathered dust while Frederick built his empire. In the 17th century, Cardinal Richelieu, the real power behind the French throne, kept a copy of The Prince in his private rooms. He went through it with a fine-tooth comb, noting where he agreed and where tweaks were needed. Richelieu understood that Niccolò had written a survival manual for a brutal world. Even Napoleon took The Prince on his military campaigns and jotted down notes in the margins. Mussolini did the same, but his copy was probably more for show than for study. Stalin didn't need to read it, he already understood it all instinctively. Yeah, 20th century dictators were naturally Machiavellian. Whether they read the book or not, its biggest influence wasn't on tyrants. Instead, it shaped the tradition of political realism that grew over the following centuries. After checking out his work, Thomas Hobbes came up with a philosophy reckon that people are naturally selfish and that states are a thing. In a situation where everyone's potentially at odds, the main gig is to create order from chaos and stability from competition. America's founding blokes, Hamilton, Madison, Adams, were huge fans of his discourses. They had a good look at his take on Roman institutions and tried to copy the good bits while dodging the dodgy ones. The checks and balances in the Constitution, the idea that ambition would cancel out ambition, and the realization that different mobs would go after power, these were all Machiavellian political theory, in action in a young republic. Today's international relations theories are built on the foundation he laid. Hans Morgenthau, who kicked off realist theory in the 20th century, Straight up said Niccolò was his intellectual mate before him. Countries go after power and security. Moral rules are a luxury that only a handful can really keep up. The world order doesn't have a top dog to enforce the rules, so every nation has to look out for itself. That's not being a downer, it's just how it is. He's been copying it non-stop. Leo Strauss reckons Niccolò taught people how to be evil, deliberately flipping Christian morals and praising bad stuff instead of good. Isaiah Berlin saw him differently, as a bloke stuck between two clashing moral systems: classic republicanism and Christian morals. Couldn't blend them, so he had to choose a side. Meanwhile, others stuck up for him as a true blue patriot. His massive love for Florence and Italy made him back harsh measures if they'd stop the chaos and foreign rule. He wasn't into tyranny for no reason. He just wanted a way to get stability. In a world falling apart, the debate will go on forever, because Niccolò himself was genuinely complicated. He praised republics, but wrote a guide for kings, celebrated Roman civic values, and told leaders to act like beasts. He backed civilian armies and knew that sometimes a ruthless dictator's needed to get order sorted before democracy can work. He was full of contradictions, because he lived in a contradictory world and refused to pretend otherwise. While other thinkers built fancy systems that ignored awkward truths, he faced those awkward truths straight on and painted them with brutal accuracy. To his critics, his biggest crime was telling it like it is. He said what everyone knew but weren't allowed to say. Leaders lie, influence matters more than fairness, and good intentions without power get you nowhere. These truths upset the old teachings of Christian Europe, the comforting idea that good gets rewarded and evil gets punished, that God's plan leads history to fair outcomes. But when Niccolò looked at history, he didn't see that at all. He saw clever leaders do well, and useless ones crash regardless of how moral they were. He watched republics fall not because they were immoral, but because they were weak. He saw foreign powers wrecking Italy as a sure result of internal squabbling and military stuff-ups, not a divine punishment. This was considered unforgivable, not because it was wrong, but because it was right, and saying it out loud shook the whole moral system that propped up authority in Christian Europe. Kings ruled by God's say-so, and the church supposedly had spiritual control over worldly stuff. Niccolò's writing hinted that it was all just a show. Real power came from military muscle, money, and the willingness to use them both. He didn't hesitate to rip back the curtain and show how things really worked. People could never unsee it. Even his loudest critics had taken that lesson on board. After reading The Prince, you couldn't go back to the naive idea that God was steering political events. The world had lost its magic. Later, Max Weber would call this the disenchantment of the world getting rid of magic and mystery from human affairs. It's the realization that social and political outcomes come from human choices, not supernatural forces. Niccolò was one of the first blokes to see politics like that, a field with its own rules, not tied to religion or morals. That's why they call him the daddy of modern political science. It's not like he was right about everything. Nah, far from it. And his advice wasn't always good. Sometimes it was shocking. But he was the first to treat politics as its own thing, with its own rules you could study by watching what happens. Before Niccolò came along, political theory was lumped in with ethics, coming from moral ideas. Plato dreamed up the perfect society run by philosopher kings with total justice. Aristotle sorted governments by how well they looked after the public good. Augustine and Aquinas tried to mix up worldly rule with God's laws. They all started with some idea of how things should be and judged reality against that. Niccolò started with reality as it actually was. He watched politics play out, noticed patterns over and over, and worked out rules from what he observed. That change from thinking it through to watching it happen was a total revolution in method, maybe even bigger than any single discovery. It opened the door for later social sciences. If you can study politics by looking at the facts, you can do the same for economics. Sociology, psychology, anthropology, human behavior becomes something you can study scientifically instead of just through moral philosophy, course, that comes with its own risks. Looking at people as things to study and control brings up moral problems we still deal with. But you can't shove the genie back in the bottle. For ages, not much was known about Niccolò's personal life. Scholars focused on the prince and ignored the bloke behind it. That changed in the 1800s when his letters were released. All of a sudden, you could see inside his head. His jokes, his complaints, his mates, his worries. The letters show him as way more complex than the cold strategist from The Prince. And he had a funny bone. He was pretty humble about himself, always skint and hitting up mates for cash. He loved his family, even though he played away from home. He stuck by his mates no matter what. He really craved recognition, but it slipped through his fingers while he was alive. A famous letter to his mate Vittori tells about a normal day when he was exiled. He gets up early, checks on the woodcutters. He reads poetry by a creek, then heads to the pub for a game of cards and a yarn with the locals, getting home at sunset. Then he puts on his fancy clothes, the ceremonial robes from his chancery days, and goes into his study. In there, he gets into it with the old writers, reading history and philosophy books, imagining chats with the great minds of ancient times. For 4 hours, I don't feel any boredom. I put all my worries aside and I'm not scared of being broke. Death doesn't frighten me. I dive right into their world. This bit is really touching. A bloke stripped of his rank, stuck out in the sticks with no money, only finding comfort in books and his imagination. But it's also a win. Even though he lost everything society valued, he had something that would last longer. The chat across the centuries with minds that got his ideas, fought with the same problems, and he was adding to that conversation. His writings would outlive the Medici, outlive Florence, outlive everyone who'd ignored him. He was writing for people down the track, even if he didn't fully realize it. His real grave in Santa Croce finally got a proper monument in 1787. 2.5 centuries after he kicked the bucket, the epitaph says, "Tanto nomini nullum par logium." No amount of praise is enough for a rep like that. Florence finally copped on to what it had lost, but that realization came way too late for the bloke. But his ideas were already doing the rounds, and that influence would shape how the modern state came about in ways that were both brilliant and worrying. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 wrapped up the 30 Years' War and brought something brand new to European politics, the idea of state sovereignty. Every state saw each other as independent bodies with total control over their own patch. Popes and emperors couldn't claim to have authority over the whole world anymore. Authority got all about geography, marked out by borders, and run through centralized bureaucracies. That was Machiavelli's idea in action. The state is like a self-governing organism with its own logic, its urgent needs, and its own raison d'etat that sat above normal morals. France under Cardinal Richelieu was a prime example of that. Even though he was a Catholic cardinal, Richelieu backed Protestant armies in the 30 Years' War because it weakened the Habsburgs and strengthened France. Religious loyalty took a back seat to national interest. He set the stage for French absolutism by centralizing power, putting down the nobles, and setting up a slick administration and a standing army. When people accused him of being dodgy, he said the state had needs that ordinary citizens don't have to worry about. He could have been quoting the prince word for word. Frederick the Great of Prussia had a good look at Machiavelli and wrote a rebuttal called Anti-Machiavelli, arguing that rulers should be ethical and steer clear of cynical power plays. But once he got into power, he ruled exactly like Machiavelli said he should. He invaded Silesia without any provocation, driven by Prussia's need for more land and Austria being weak. He tricked his allies, broke treaties whenever it suited him, and turned Prussia into a top European power through cunning and military strength. The gap between what princes say and what they actually do was rarely so wide open. England took a different path, but ended up with similar ideas. Thomas Hobbes, writing during England's Civil War, said in Leviathan that humans in their natural state are always at war with each other. Life becomes lonely, poor, nasty, brutal, and short. The only fix is a social contract where people give up their natural freedom to a ruler strong enough to keep the peace. The ruler's power doesn't come from God, but from that agreement and the ability to keep people safe. Morality just becomes whatever the boss says it is. Without a government, there's no right or wrong, just power. That's basically Machiavelli's logic, turned into a proper political theory. A state doesn't need to be good in the usual sense. It just needs to be strong enough to stop chaos. Everything else is secondary. America's founding fathers had a good read of Machiavelli. The Federalist Papers even name-drop him. They got his main point. Republics, if built right, can be more stable than monarchies, and systems that check each other matter more than how honest the leaders are. Madison's argument in Federalist Paper No. 10 about factions is pure Machiavelli. You can't get rid of greed and ambition in people, so you set up a system where opposing interests keep each other in check. The US Constitution assumes politicians are motivated by ambition and self-interest, and it uses that to create stability. Morality's a nice idea, but a government can't bank on it. Napoleon Bonaparte was famous for having a copy of The Prince by his bed. He filled the margins with heaps of notes, having a bit of a debate with Machiavelli. He reckoned the analysis was good, but thought he could do better, that extraordinary talent could go beyond the usual rules. Napoleon's own story proved Machiavelli right about too much ambition. He conquered heaps of Europe, but couldn't hold on to it. He ignored the rule that you gotta avoid making enemies, that conquerors need to get genuine support or rule through organized fear. He tried to strike a deal and ended up losing everything. Getting kicked out and failing just showed that the tough logic from that book was spot on. Back in the 19th century, Machiavelli went from being a controversial bloke to a proper part of political science. They taught him openly at uni, and historians gave him a fair go instead of just bagging him. People still moralized about him, but now they had to deal with academics admiring him. German thinkers really got into him. Hegel reckoned he understood what makes a state tick. Ranker saw him as the bloke who started modern political realism. Treitschke argued the state operates beyond good and evil, and that power politics is its own sort of moral code. This sort of thinking was always going to lead to disaster. Bismarck united Germany with what he called blood and iron while cooking up diplomatic dramas. He started fights when Prussia was ready and the other guys weren't, building a German empire through deliberate aggro. He was Machiavellian to the core. Calculated, practical, happy to use any trick, and totally focused on results. And it worked. Germany became the top dog in Europe. The unification was seen as a win for practical leadership over wishy-washy idealism, but that victory had disaster written all over it. If a state doesn't give a toss about morals, and political power is the only thing that matters, what happens when states go head-to-head? The answer came in 1914. World War I was the end result of a no-holds-barred contest between nations. Each power went after its own goals, making perfect sense from its own point of view. Austria had to wipe out Serbia to save face, while Russia had to back Serbia to keep its clout in the Balkans. Germany had to help Austria and hit France before Russia got its troops mobilized, and France and Britain had to stand up to German dominance. From a realist point of view, all those decisions made sense. The result was a 4-year industrialized slaughter that killed millions and tore down 4 empires. After the war, people desperately needed someone to blame, and Machiavelli was an easy target. They said German militarism came from Machiavelli's lack of morals. The worship of state power without any moral limits had directly led to trench warfare. The League of Nations was set up specifically to replace power games with collective security and international law. Idealism came back into fashion, and realism got pushed aside. But then the dictators showed up. Mussolini loved Machiavelli, wrote a thesis on him, and often quoted his stuff. He saw himself as the modern-day ruler who'd restore Italy's glory through grit and power. His fascism was a mix of nationalism and Machiavellian pragmatism, taken to an authoritarian extreme. The state is everything, the individual means nothing, and morality is only about what boosts the nation's strength. Hitler never directly mentioned Machiavelli, but he operated entirely on Machiavellian principles. Lie whenever it helps, tear up treaties without a second thought, use fear and showmanship to hold power, and either wipe out enemies completely or avoid conflict altogether. The only differences were in scale and ideology. Machiavelli's work was all about holding power in Italian city-states. Hitler used the exact same logic for conquering Europe and wiping out whole populations. After the war, people had mixed feelings about Machiavelli. You couldn't just write him off anymore. The idealistic approach of the League of Nations had ended in a complete disaster. Chamberlain's attempt at moral negotiation with Hitler at Munich actually made the aggression worse. The democratic countries had to get real and adopt practical strategies, a balance of power outlook, and a willingness to use military force. Churchill's way of leading was dead-set Machiavellian. He didn't flinch from sizing up threats and went hell for leather to win. After that, the Cold War was obviously Machiavellian too. 2 big players fought for global clout, using every trick short of open war. They'd prop up dictators when it suited, knock over governments when needed, and only cared about who had the power. George Kennan, the bloke who came up with America's containment strategy, took a fair bit of inspiration from Machiavelli. His famous long telegram breaking down how the Soviets operated was a top-notch realist take. He knew getting morally outraged was useless. The real trick was understanding what the Soviets wanted and coming up with ways to push back. Hans Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations became the bedrock of international relations theory, dripping with Machiavellian ideas. Countries go after power. It's not good or bad, it's just what they do. Good policy means copying that truth and acting accordingly. Kissinger's foreign policy in the 70s was the absolute peak of Machiavellian strategy in America. That meant dealing with China to balance out the Soviets and backing Pakistan, even while they were doing horrible stuff in Bangladesh, because Pakistan helped America's interests. He also backed Pinochet's takeover of Chile because Allende was cozy with the Soviets. Thinking about morals just got in the way of good diplomacy, so national interest was the only thing that mattered. Opponents called it cynical, supporters reckoned it was just practical. That argument's never going to end because the core conflict can't be resolved. Should countries go after their goals without any mercy, or hold back with ethical rules? Realists reckon bringing morality into foreign policy is stupid. It leads to disaster when you're up against enemies who've got no such qualms. Idealists say that pure realism causes a race to the bottom, making atrocities inevitable and eating away at the values democracies claim to stand for. Both sides have history backing them up. Each can point to disasters from the other guy's approach. Machiavelli would probably say that's a dodgy question. He wasn't about morality for its own sake. Instead, he argued that leaders face situations where doing the right thing causes more harm than being deliberately tough. A leader who refuses to lie when a lie could stop a war is responsible for the lives lost. A prince who stays loyal to a dodgy enemy will end up with his people getting stomped on. The choice isn't about ethics versus corruption, it's about different sorts of responsibility. Modern scholarship has helped fix his rep. Isaiah Berlin reckoned Machiavelli wasn't bagging morality. He was showing there's more than one ethical system, and they sometimes butt heads. Christian ethics go for humility, forgiveness, and heavenly stuff. Civic ethics are all about power, fame, and getting ahead in this world. Both are legit moral codes. The bummer is you can't fully stick to both, and choosing one means ditching the other. Machiavelli went with civic ethics and spelled out what that requires. Quentin Skinner put Machiavelli in the Republican tradition, showing how a lot of his ideas were about protecting freedom from dictators. The Discourses on Livy is basically a how-to for keeping independent republics going. The advice it gives is often pretty harsh, but the goal is to stop power from piling up. That kind of concentration kills freedom. Looking at it that way, Machiavelli comes across as a champion of republics rather than an excuser for dictators. Also, folks have noticed how his own tough times really shaped his work. He lived through the Italian wars, watching foreign armies trash his homeland while Italian leaders were useless and divided. His harshness comes from pure desperation. His goal was to save Italy from being pushed around by teaching its leaders how to survive in a brutal world they didn't create. His tough stance comes from love of country, not a dislike for morals. The bloke who wrote this wasn't a monster or just a pragmatic sort. Nah, he was someone who'd seen way too much, lost everything, and tried to make sense of the mess by getting to the bottom of it. These letters show him as pretty much a regular bloke. He whinged about money, had a laugh with mates, played cards in country pubs, and hoped to get back into public service, something that never eventuated. He kicked the bucket in 1527, not sure if anyone would ever read his stuff or give a toss about his ideas. The reaction came slowly at first, then hit like a ton of bricks 500 years later. His name's now another word for political slyness. His ideas still shape how we see power, and his questions ain't been answered yet. Should we judge leaders by their intentions or their results? What's better, being loved or being feared? Can republics last if there's no civic virtue? How do you keep freedom without things turning to chaos? When is it okay to do something dodgy for a good outcome? These are the questions he put forward. People are still arguing over his answers today. His bones are in a tomb at Santa Croce, but the brain that wrote The Prince is still ticking in anyone who really gets into political thinking. That's the sort of immortality he scored. Not through stone monuments, but through ideas that became dead set necessary. Maybe dangerous ideas, but necessary all the same. Without these ideas, you can't understand power at all. You can't handle political reality by pretending they're not true. Machiavelli forces us to stare at the stuff we'd rather ignore. That's why he still makes us uncomfortable. That's why we can't do without him. The whole thing was over in just a few hours. 500 Athenians crammed onto wooden benches, listening to 3 prosecutors paint Socrates as a dangerous rebel who led the youth off track and didn't believe in the gods. The evidence was thin, mostly based on bitterness and worry. Athens had just copped a massive military loss, and its democracy had been knocked over for a bit by dictators. The city was hurting, suspicious, looking for someone to blame. Socrates could have easily got himself off the hook. Back then in Athens, the usual defense tactic was to cry, beg, and bring your kids in to plead for mercy. The jurors were known to be soft on emotional plays, but Socrates didn't use any of that. Instead, he did exactly what he always did. He asked questions, spoke calmly, logically, and even had a bit of a laugh. He suggested that instead of getting the death penalty, he deserved free meals for life in the Prytaneum, the highest honor Athens could give. After all, his whole life was about improving his fellow citizens, shaking them out of their thoughtless beliefs. He'd been Athens's gadfly, biting the lazy old horse of the city-state to wake it up. The jurors weren't impressed. Plato saw hands go up. 280 for guilty, 220 for not guilty. A close call, but decisive. Then came the part where they decide the punishment. Socrates got one last chance to suggest something other than the death sentence, and he put forward a small cash fine. The contempt was clear as day. The next vote had a bigger margin. Death by hemlock, with 360 inches favor. What's interesting is that more jurors backed the death penalty after seeing Socrates' stubborn attitude than had first found him guilty. Socrates took the verdict with a creepily calm composure. He told the court that a good person can't be hurt by any bad thing, in this life or the next. He said that a life without thinking things over ain't worth living. Then, calmly, he was led out of the courtroom. Plato just stood there, stunned. He was the sharpest bloke in Athens, maybe even the whole world. And the democratic city he loved had just given him the death penalty. Why? Because he asked questions, got people thinking, and didn't just accept easy answers. That injustice cracked Plato's mind open. Right then, a question formed in his head, one that'd bug him for 50 years. It pushed him to travel the Mediterranean, start a school, and write chats that'd shape how people think for ages. What's justice really about? If Athens can knock off Socrates and call it lawful, then what does justice even mean? To get why this killing mattered so much, we gotta go back to where Plato came from. Yeah, picture the world he was born into and all the things that made him who he was before he met the bloke who'd change everything. He was born Aristotle around 428, or 427 BC. In Athens, the city that ran the Greek world, the name Plato came along later, a nickname with a dodgy origin. Some thought it was cause of his broad shoulders from wrestling. Others reckoned it pointed to his big forehead, a sign of smarts. Whatever the reason, the name stuck, and Aristocles got forgotten. Back in Athens, family was everything. On his dad's side, Ariston claimed he was a direct descendant of Codrus, the last king of Athens' family tree stretching back into legend. On his mum's side, Perictione could track her ancestry back to Solon, the famous lawmaker. Solon had overhauled Athenian society 200 years earlier and set up the basics of democracy. This wasn't just being upper class. These were the top families that shaped Athens in its early days. And along with that heritage came the dough, properties, slaves, education, and influence. Plato grew up in a house where political power was just a given. The question wasn't whether you'd serve the state, but how. His childhood played out under the Parthenon, that gorgeous temple to Athena, gleaming white on the Acropolis, a symbol of Athens' might. But the bloke who built it, the powerful leader Pericles, had already snuffed it before Plato could even remember him. Pericles had taken Athens to its peak. The world Plato got wasn't the confident, expanding empire his grandparents knew. Nah, it was a place tangled up in war. The Peloponnesian War kicked off in 431 BC, 3 years before Plato showed up. And it kept going till he was a young bloke. Athens took on Sparta. Democracy went up against oligarchy. Navy power fought land armies, a brutal scrap for dominance that'd gobble up the Greek world for a generation. War touched everything. Plato's earliest memories would have been colored by it. Non-stop funeral marches as bodies came back from distant missions, the public speeches at the Ceramicus, that big cemetery where Athens honored its dead. The fear every summer when Sparta's army marched into Attica and burnt the crops, forcing countryfolk to hide behind Athens' big walls. But despite the war, Plato got the education that matched his social status. He did gymnastics training. His body got tough from wrestling and running. He got into music, learning the lyre and the numbers that controlled musical harmony. He memorized Homer, the foundation of all Greek culture, probably rattling off bits of the Iliad and Odyssey by heart. He also got into maths, especially geometry, which the Greeks believed revealed eternal truths hiding under the mess of the physical world. This whole program was designed to mold a political leader, someone who could speak well in the assembly, lead troops in battle, and govern wisely in peacetime. Every part of Plato's upbringing pushed him towards a standard life of aristocratic public service. His family expected it. Athens demanded it. He was training hard to lock in his place among the city's top dogs. He'd be one of those blokes in the assembly, talking and deciding the fate of massive empires. But the Athens young Plato knew was nothing like the confident empire his grandfather saw. It was a city wreck in itself. And this young fellow was about to watch democracy show its ugliest side. By the time Plato was a teenager, the war had been dragging on for more than 15 years, leaving Athens stuffed and knackered. Pericles' smart idea to avoid fighting Sparta on land and hit him by sea had gone completely pear-shaped. In 430 BC, a brutal plague ripped through the packed city, killing about a quarter of the people, including Pericles. Thucydides, the famous historian who lived through it, wrote about dead bodies piled up in the streets and society fallen apart from fear and despair. Into this power vacuum stepped blokes like Alcibiades, smart as a whip but totally dodgy, good-looking and loaded. That charming Alcibiades was the perfect example of all the dangerous bits of Athens' democracy. With his gift of the gab, he could twist the assembly around and talk the people into chasing glory and war. But whenever his plans went south, he'd swap sides to Sparta and help Athens' enemies. This bloke summed up Athens' brilliant but self-destructing, just as likely to do something great as stuff up big time. The worst of these disasters happened when Plato was around 13. In 415 BCE, Athens launched the Sicilian expedition, trying to take over Syracuse, a tough Greek city-state on Sicily. This was pure madness, dressed up as ambition. The assembly, riled up by demagogues promising an easy win and heaps of treasure, voted to send out the biggest fleet ever. Athens had scraped together up to 200 ships, plus thousands of hoplites and sailors, the cream of its men. The result was an absolute disaster. The whole campaign was wiped out in 413 BCE. The entire navy was obliterated. Thousands of Athenian soldiers either died fighting or ended up as slaves in Syracuse's quarries, working till they dropped in the Sicilian sun. Athens never properly recovered. The city that used to rule the Aegean was now vulnerable, with an empty coffers and a shattered army. Right in the middle of all this, young Plato watched democracy in action. He saw the assembly, that big show of the people's will, swinging wildly between confidence and panic, changing from one position to the opposite in just a few weeks. He saw how demagogues, smooth talkers, who told the mob exactly what they wanted to hear, could con the people into making disastrous decisions. He saw with his own eyes that the crowd could be swayed more by flashy talk than reason, and by emotional appeals rather than careful thought. That same assembly, which had been dead keen on the Sicilian campaign, later killed or exiled the commanders who tried to save the situation from disaster. This wasn't just some theory for Plato. His own family members were right in the thick of these political feuds. Some blokes, like Critias, his mum's cousin, started to reckon democracy itself was the problem. What Athens needed, they reckon, was the strong hand of its best citizens, the aristos, to run things without the uneducated mob sticking their nose in. The ongoing war was revealing an ugly truth. Democracy, the very system Athens bragged, made it better than Sparta's rigid oligarchy, was proven to be chaotic, savage, and ultimately harmful to itself. This style of government could be twisted, could make terrible decisions, and could even turn on its own people. The seeds of Plato's later doubt about democracy were planted back then. He watched his city stumble from one mess to another and saw the people cheering on plans that would end up destroying him. Right in the middle of all this chaos, a strange bloke wandered through the marketplace, asking questions that made powerful blokes look like idiots. It wasn't long before young Plato would meet this bloke. Socrates was both impossible to ignore and easy to take the piss out of. He was short, with a barrel chest, a flat nose, bulging eyes, and thick lips. In winter, he'd walk around barefoot, and all year round he wore the same rough old tunic. He lived in poverty, married to Xantippe, a woman famous in Athens for her sharp tongue, and he didn't have a regular job. By normal standards, he was a total failure. Still, heaps of young fellows from Athens were keen on him. Round about 408 BC, when Plato was about 20, he fell under Socrates' spell. What got him, and a bunch of other well-off young blokes interested, wasn't Socrates' looks, money, or status. It was his way of doing things. Imagine this down at the Agora, the main marketplace, where all the Athenian civic stuff happened. A top general called Laches is going on and on about bravery. He's been in heaps of battles, so he reckons he can spot courage straight away. Socrates wanders over, all polite and curious. So what exactly is courage? The general's keen to explain. He says courage is about standing your ground in a fight and not buggering off. But what about tactical retreats? Socrates mentions the Spartans at Thermopylae, who pulled back to trick the Persians. Would you call that cowardice? No way. So courage can't just be about sticking around. All right, maybe courage is having the guts to keep going. But if you're just being a bloody idiot charging in recklessly, that's not really courage, is it? And smart endurance for dodgy purposes doesn't cut it either. So, is courage about smart perseverance for a good cause? By this point, Laches is totally confused, and everything that seems simple is now a mess. Socrates doesn't give any answers. He just shows that Laches, with all his years of experience, can't really define courage. This method was called elenchus, meaning refutation, and it absolutely flattened him. This way of doing things was risky and thrilling. Risky because it made powerful people look like they didn't know much, crumbling the authority of politicians, generals, priests, anyone who claimed to be an expert. In a society that put honor and reputation above pretty much everything, Socrates strolled around Athens making the upper class look silly on purpose. But it was also exciting because it was honest. These people didn't actually have the knowledge they bragged about. They got by on untested assumptions, inherited prejudices, and the way things had always been done. Socrates showed the truth. Most people, even those in charge, were just drifting through life without stopping to think about the big questions. What's justice all about? What's virtue? What makes a good life? How should we live? Socrates was the total opposite of the sophists, those paid teachers who ruled the intellectual scene in Athens. Sophists taught rhetoric, the art of persuading people, and charged heaps for it. They promised to make young blokes successful, able to argue any side and win in public meetings or court cases. Socrates had no time for them. He didn't take any money, said he taught nothing, claimed he knew nothing, and just asked questions. But inside those questions, just by asking them, something amazing happened. People began to think for themselves. Instead of just accepting passed-down wisdom or flashy arguments, they had a proper look at their own beliefs to see if they stacked up. For Plato, this was a game changer. The group of young blokes around Socrates included Plato's own family and mates. Critias, talented and ambitious, was there, and so was Charmides, Plato's uncle, good-looking and clever, who also hung around Socrates. Even Alcibiades was a follower of Socrates before his political dreams got the better of him. These were Athens rich and powerful, and Socrates was accidentally teaching them that a lot of what their city took for granted might be wrong. Socrates reckoned that the bloke who knows he doesn't know much is the wisest, and that an unexamined life isn't worth living. Plus, true virtue wasn't something you inherited from your posh family, and you couldn't get it from money or power either. For Plato, virtue was all about knowledge and understanding, coming from constant questioning and honest thinking. Socrates was more than just a teacher. He was the perfect example of what people could be. He might have been a bit rough-looking, but he was beautiful on the inside. Didn't have much stuff, but he was rich in spirit. Even though he had no real power on the world stage, he was free in a way no general or politician ever could be. But in 404 BC, Athens' long war finally ended in total defeat. What came next threw the city into fear and pushed Socrates and his young followers right into the middle of a nightmare. When Sparta finally starved Athens into giving up in 404 BC, the victors didn't show an ounce of mercy. The long walls, those big defensive structures that connected Athens to Piraeus harbor and protected the city for ages, were torn down while flute music played. It was a total disgrace, a public statement that Athens' empire was finished. The Spartans installed a puppet government, picking Athenian nobles to run the show. These blokes had always reckoned democracy was the cause of all the city's problems. One of them was Critias, Plato's cousin on his mum's side. The 30, as they became known, took over with Spartan backing, and straight away began a reign of terror. They said their goal was to bring back the old constitution and put Athens under the control of the best people. Really, though, they were just a bunch of thugs using state power. Within just a few months, they executed 15 Athenian citizens without any trial. No doubt the victims were political enemies. But they also went after rich medics, foreigners living in Athens whose property could be snatched. The 30 needed cash to pay for their Spartan soldiers, and murder turned out to be a pretty effective way to raise funds. Plato's own uncle, Charmides, was part of this government. The very same young blokes who used to sit at Socrates' feet asking about justice and goodness were now overseeing murders and property seizures. Fear had a tight hold on the city. There were informants everywhere, and just being accused could get you killed. Property was taken, and families fled into exile. Socrates refused to join in. Then came the moment when the 30 summoned Socrates and 4 other blokes. They ordered them to go to Salamis and arrest Leon, a wealthy and respected bloke, so they could execute him and seize his property. It was a test of loyalty. What's more, it was a way to drag more Athenians into the regime's crimes, spreading the guilt so wide that fighting back became impossible. Socrates heard the order. He just went home without a fuss. Didn't give a speech or anything, he simply refused to do it. The other 4 went to Salamis, grabbed Leon, and he was executed as instructed. Socrates did nothing. But, by doing nothing, he showed real moral guts. He was already an old bloke in his 60s, pretty unnoticed, and quirky enough that the 30 couldn't be bothered punishing him. But the message was clear. He wouldn't be a part of it, not even to save his own skin. For Plato watching this all happen, the difference must have been unbearable. His own family, people from his own class, cultured and educated, were committing atrocities while pretending to run a proper government. That strange barefoot thinker, the bloke Athens laughed at as weird and useless, was the only one with the moral sense to say no. The 30's rule only lasted 8 months. Democratic exiles led by Thrasybulus gathered soldiers and marched on Athens. In the short civil war that followed, both Critias and Charmides were killed fighting the Democrats. The 30 were kicked out, their Spartan backers left, and democracy was restored in 403 BC. But the new democracy wasn't forgiving. It was hurt, bitter, and full of suspicion. They announced a blanket amnesty, so no one could be prosecuted for stuff they did under the tyranny. But everyone knew who'd backed the oppressors and who'd stood against them. The city was still split, suspicious, and always watching for enemies within. So the rebuilt democracy, looking for someone to blame and dead set on getting rid of any threat to its safety, turned its attention to this bloke. He'd questioned everything, and his followers included Athens' worst tyrants and its most dangerous free thinkers. The trial went down in spring 399 BCE, 4 years after the 30 tyrants got booted out. The courtroom was thick with leftover resentment. At 70, Socrates was still pretty fit despite his age, and his mind was just as sharp and unsettling as ever. The charges against him were vague but deadly, not respecting the gods of Athens and leading the youth astray. Under all the legal mumbo-jumbo, the real charge was simple. Socrates asked too many questions, and some of his old students had become tyrants. 3 blokes stepped up to accuse him. Miletus, a no-name young poet, reckoned he was speaking for the poets Socrates had taken the mickey out of. Anytus, a wealthy leatherworker and democratic leader, spoke for the tradespeople and the restored democracy, which was still worried about aristocratic conspiracies. Lycon represented the rhetoricians. The smooth talkers Socrates had always bagged as peddlers of empty persuasion, not real knowledge. Each accuser had their own reasons, but the real charge was never said out loud. Socrates always made people feel uncomfortable, and after 50 years of that, Athens was over it. The jury had 500 citizens, picked at random the democratic way, sitting in a big semicircle. These were ordinary folk shopkeepers, farmers, soldiers, tasked with deciding if that weird philosopher who hung out at the agora should live or die. Socrates could have won him over. Athenian juries were famous for being moved by emotional stuff. A few tears, some begging, maybe bringing his 3 boys in to plead for their dad's life. If he'd done that, the result might have been different. He wouldn't do any of that. Instead, Socrates put on a defense that was more like a lecture than a plea. He grilled his accusers with the same relentless method he'd always used, catching them in contradictions. While making them look silly, he made it clear his whole life had been about serving Athens. He was on a holy mission to expose ignorance and push his fellow Athenians towards a deeper wisdom. He said a life that isn't examined isn't worth living. When they asked him to propose a penalty besides death, he suggested Athens should give him free meals at the Prytaneum paid for by the public. That was the highest honor the city could give, normally only for Olympic winners and the city's top benefactors. The jurors weren't amused. The first vote was close, 280 for guilty, 220 for not guilty. Just a swing of 30 votes would have set him free. But then came the punishment phase, and Socrates' contempt for the whole thing sealed his fate. The second vote was a landslide. 360 jurors voted for the death penalty. His defiant attitude convinced 80 jurors who thought he was innocent that he still deserved to die. Socrates took the verdict with a calm that was disturbing. He told the jurors he wasn't angry. He reckoned dying might be a gift, either a dreamless sleep or a trip to some place where he could keep questioning alongside the ancient heroes. Then, he was taken to prison. A religious event, the Delian mission to honor Apollo, delayed his execution by a whole month. The ship for Delos had already left, and no executions were allowed till it came back. Socrates spent the month chained up in a tiny room, welcoming anyone who came to visit him. His mates turned up real upset and sad, cooking up a plan for him to nick off. Crito, one of his closest cobbers, sorted it all, bribing the guards, a safe escape route out of Athens, and a hidey hole in Thessaly. Socrates knocked back the chat, later recreated by Plato in the dialogue Crito, which became a cornerstone of Western moral philosophy. Socrates reckoned that doing a runner would be an immoral act. He'd spent his whole life in Athens, enjoying the perks of its laws and raising his kids in its safety. To break those laws now, just cause they'd turned on him, would be to follow a principle: justice is whatever benefits yourself. That'd make him a hypocrite. If the law's unjust, he argued, you work to change it, but you don't break it to save your own skin. The law's more important than any one bloke. His mates were ballin'. Socrates stayed stone cold. The big day came. The boat from Delos was back, and the execution could go ahead. The events were later written down by Phaedo, one of the young fellas who was there. Socrates spent his last hours chewing the fat about philosophy, talking about the soul's immortality all calm as. When the jailer brought the cup of hemlock, made from that poisonous plant, and mixed with water, Socrates took it without any hesitation. He asked if he could pour a drink offering to the gods. The jailer said there was only enough for the deadly dose. Socrates grinned, downed it in one steady gulp, then walked around the room as told until his legs got heavy. He lay down. The poison crept up from his feet, slowly going numb all over. He stayed alert right till the end, still talking, still chilled. His last words were a bit weird, and it's had commentators baffled ever since. Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay that debt, and don't forget it. Asclepius was the god of healing, and offering a rooster was the usual sacrifice after getting better from sickness. Was Socrates saying that death was like a cure, a heal, a freedom from life's sickness? No one knows. Then he went still. Crito closed his eyes, and Plato wasn't there. The record says Plato was sick. Whether this was a real sickness or an excuse, a way to avoid watching what he couldn't bear to see, remains one of history's little mysteries. Maybe guilt? Or just grief too hard to face? The bloke who'd spend the rest of his life writing dialogues where Socrates was the hero, the main man in almost every chat, couldn't bring himself to watch his mentor die. In that moment, when the hemlock did its final job, and Socrates stopped breathing, something shifted in the young aristocrat watching from a distance. The question that would fill the next 50 years of Plato's life became crystal clear. How could the best bloke be put to death by the worst system? Athens, the city that claimed to stand for justice, had just knocked off the one person who really knew what justice meant. Democracy, the system that said it gave wisdom through the people's voice, had shown it could make absolute shockers. The majority had condemned the wise, the ignorant had shut up the truthful, and the sleepwalkers had knocked off the one bloke trying to wake 'em up. Plato would spend 80 years looking for an answer. He'd travel across the Mediterranean, chasing wisdom through maths and mysticism. He'd start the academy, training minds to think clearly through the mess. He'd write dialogues that kept Socrates alive, talking, asking questions, and calling out ignorance with deadly accuracy. He dreamt up a perfect city, run by philosopher kings, folks who understood the forms and crawled out of the cave to see the sun. That city never eventuated, and in Syracuse, he watched his mate Dion get knocked off by a bloke who reckoned he was a philosopher. He copped the tough truth that philosophy and politics might never line up, but he kept on asking, what's justice? What's real? How should we live? 2,400 years on, we're still none the wiser. Every political debate about experts versus democracy goes back to Plato's dilemma. Every maths discovery that seems to uncover timeless truths echoes his theory of forms. Whenever someone knocks back easy answers and gets stuck into questioning the foundations of belief, Socrates lives on. The shadows are still flickering on the cave wall. While most people still reckon those shadows are real, a few look away, a few climb toward the light. Some ask the questions that put the wind up those in charge. Plato made sure the conversation Socrates started would keep going forever. Philosophy ain't just a bunch of answers to memorize by heart. It's a practice, a way of life, a commitment to asking questions even when it's dodgy. The academy closed its doors in 529 CE, but the spirit never died. It lives on wherever someone stops to ask why, wherever someone refuses to just drift through life, wherever truth matters more than comfort. Socrates drank the hemlock and kicked the bucket. Plato picked up the pen and wrote those dialogues that saved a voice, a way of thinking, a soul. He left us something that neither tyranny nor democracy could wipe out: the examined life, the big questions, and the guts to think. An old bloke of 70-odd dying in 399 BCE should have been just a footnote, a weirdo who asked too many questions, a pain in the neck for the powers that be. The hemlock was meant to shut him up, making him just another victim of Athens' post-war paranoia and tyranny. The grave should have been the end of it, but a young aristocrat called Plato made sure it was only the start. Over the next 50 years, he turned grief into philosophical investigation, anger into logic, and loss into writing. He kept Socrates alive by putting him in every dialogue, making him the eternal questioner who keeps exposing ignorance. The real Socrates died, but his philosophical version became immortal. Plato's answer to the question that knocked him around, what is justice?, consumed his whole life. In Times the Republic, he pictured a perfect society run by philosophers, with everyone doing their bit. The Symposium Times turned love into a ladder climbing toward eternal beauty. The Pythagoreans backed the idea that the soul lives forever. Then along came Times Timaeus. Plato spelled out the maths behind the universe and the laws he wrote up in his later years. Realizing perfection's a pipe dream, he put together a second-best ideal city for flawed humanity. But the dialogues hardly ever give simple answers. They end up just as confused as they are clear. Even as a character in a book, Socrates keeps asking questions that only lead deeper into thought. That was on purpose. Philosophy ain't about memorizing doctrines. It's about learning how to reason. What Plato gave us wasn't a neat system, but a way of doing things. Not final answers, but the practice of inquiry. His school, the academy, lasted 900 years, the longest-running educational joint in recorded history. The academy taught mathematicians, thinkers, politicians, and scholars. Aristotle spent 20 years there before starting his own school and coming up with a different take on life. This academy was the model for every university that came after. Places where people get together, not to be brainwashed, but to explore. When Emperor Justinian finally shut it down in 529 CE, sending the last pagan philosophers into exile, he closed the school but not its legacy. Plato's ideas had already got around, getting woven into Christian thinking through Augustine and kept alive in Islamic philosophy. Then they were rediscovered in the Renaissance, talked about in Enlightenment chats, and still get studied in schools today. At the heart of what he taught are the forms, the immortal soul, and the trip from the physical to the spiritual. That idea of a truth behind just appearances turned into a cornerstone of Western thought. We chuck around the word Platonic all the time without remembering where it comes from. From Platonic love to Platonic ideals and Platonic solids, our lingo's still hanging on to a philosopher who kicked the bucket 2,400 years ago. His biggest impact ain't about any specific belief. Instead, It's his claim that surface appearances can trick you, and that careful thinking can dig up truths our senses can't see. A life that gets examined is the only one really worth living. That covers scientists chasing math's rules that run nature, people who question authority instead of just obeying, and students who want proper definitions rather than fuzzy statements. Whether they know it or not, these blokes are Plato's intellectual descendants. The cave allegory sticks around because we see ourselves in it. We're still stuck, watching just shadows and mistaking them for reality. Most people never even turn around. We get cozy in the dark, and sunlight would hurt. But a few do turn, climb out, break free, and see the sun. Then the hardest bit comes, going back into the cave to free those who don't want to be freed, who pick familiar illusions over tough reality. Plato knew that all too well. He saw Socrates try to wake up Athens and end up getting killed for it. He went to Syracuse 3 times to set up a philosopher king, but every trip ended in a mess. He got how much pushback truth always gets. He realized that wisdom and power rarely go together. He also knew most folks would rather shut up the messenger than accept the message, but he kept writing non-stop. In his final years, old and tired, with his hearing going and eyesight fading, he kept plugging away at the laws. He refined his idea of the second-best city. He died while still thinking, still asking questions, still trying to make sense of justice in a world that killed the most decent bloke he ever knew. For centuries, his grave at Santa Croce had no writing on it. Florence, the Renaissance city that dug up his writings and made him crucial to humanist education, later honored him with a monument. But the real tributes can't be seen. These are the questions we can't stop asking. The idea that something eternal exists past the physical world. The belief that truth matters more than comfort. Socrates asked about courage, justice, and knowledge, but he never gave final answers. Plato spent 80 years building on those questions, checking out possible answers, and showing how deep the problems go. Neither him nor Socrates gave us absolute certainty. What they both gave us is way more valuable. Knowing that certainty often tricks you, and that real wisdom comes from admitting how much we don't know. It's been 2,400 years since Plato's Athens. The city-states are gone, the gods are forgotten, and political systems have changed so much you wouldn't recognize them. But the core questions are still the same. What's justice? What's real? How should we live? And what makes life worth living? These aren't just old relics, they're lasting bits of human consciousness. Every generation meets them fresh, and each person has to find their own answers. Plato's cleverness was realizing these questions can't be sorted for good. They need constant living with, battling, and questioning. Whenever we reckon we've nailed them down for good, we've stopped thinking. We've become those sleepwalkers Socrates warned about. We've slipped back into the comfy darkness of the cave. The dialogues are there to keep us awake. They're made to puzzle as much as to shed light, to stir things up rather than calm us down. Getting into these works feels like having a yarn with Socrates. You end up more stumped than when you started, but that confusion's actually worthwhile. It kicks off real thinking, not finishes it, and that's the legacy. It's not a set of beliefs to adopt, but a method to use, not pre-packaged answers to memorize, but questions to chase. It's about letting go of needing certainty and honestly copping to just how much we don't know. Plato saw the best bloke he knew get knocked off and wondered why. He spent the rest of his days trying to work it out. He gave us the gear to keep asking questions. The chat he started is still going. This idea runs through every philosophy chat, every science lab, every court where justice is argued. It gets to anyone who stops to think whether the life they're living is really the one they should be living. Even now, shadows are flickering on the cave wall. Most mob are happy just watching, but a few look away. A few spot the chains, a few start the hard slog up towards the light, and when they come out, they're squinting and all confused. Stepping into a reality way more vivid than anything they'd imagined, they realize others have gone this path before them. Plato mapped the course. Socrates showed why it matters. Living thoughtfully is tough. It's way easier to cop what you're told, go with the crowd, and never poke at what's underneath. But Plato and Socrates, their voices ringing through the ages, reckon that just cause something's easy doesn't mean it's good. And you shouldn't mistake comfort for truth. An unexamined life, no matter how cushy or successful by the world's standards, is empty at the core. And they don't offer any comfort. They don't promise any certainty. The only thing they guarantee is that thinking clearly is harder than it looks, and that most of our treasured beliefs fall apart when you really look at them. But they also reckon that after the breakdown, after the bewilderment, after the humbling admission of how much you don't know, there's something, not perfect knowledge or final answers, but real understanding, earned with effort and fragile, which makes everything else worth it. The gates of the academy closed 1500 years ago. The olive trees in the sacred grove have been dead for ages. Scribes copied and recopied the texts until the original papyrus turned to dust. But the voice still carries on. Socrates, with his maddening questions, and Plato, writing them down for all time, both urging us to wake up, both making us use our noggins. That call is still echoing. This echo will keep going as long as there are people to hear it, because the alternative, an unexamined life, comfortable darkness, illusions mistaken for truth, isn't really living, it's just surviving. And Plato, after seeing the noblest bloke choose death over that sort of life, made sure we'd always remember the difference.